A gas station in Dallas. A young woman and a man locked in a heated exchange. She tries to walk away. He won't let her. What happens next is captured on surveillance footage, silent, undeniable. Within seconds, everything changes. A single act of violence carried out in plain sight. The people around them don't realize what's happening until it's too late. She falls to the ground. He vanishes into the night. Who was Gabriella Gonzalez? Why was she targeted? And how did a decision she made just days earlier lead to this tragic moment? The answers lie in the details, messages left unread, warnings unheeded, and a past that held all the signs of what was coming. This is the story of a woman who tried to escape and the man who refused to let her go. Stay with us as we uncover the chilling details of this tragic case. In Dallas, Texas, Gabriella Gonzalez was known as a mother, a sister, a daughter. At 26 years old, she was raising 3 young children, working hard to give them a future. She was kind, devoted, and full of life, always looking out for those she loved. But within the fabric of her daily existence, there was something far heavier pressing down on her. Harold Thompson entered her life under circumstances that were unremarkable, a meeting like so many others, a relationship that began with affection, promises, and the illusion of something real. In the beginning, he could be charming, protective, even thoughtful, but as time passed, control seeped into that dynamic. What once felt like love soon became something else. Gabriella's family saw the change before she could put it into words. There was a hesitation in the way she spoke, a shift in the way she carried herself. Conversations about her future became conversations about survival. She confided in her sister, Melanie Rubio, but the answer was never simple. "I knew she wasn't okay," Melanie later recalled, "but we couldn't help. We didn't know how." Gabriella had spoken about leaving, about finding a way out. But the reality of leaving someone like Harold Thompson was far more complex than simply walking away. The police reports paint a picture of a man unwilling to let go. Thompson was no stranger to violence. It had escalated before. There were moments Gabriella had suffered in silence, and moments she had tried to speak up. In March of 2023, just 2 months before her death, she had done what many women in her position never do. She filed a report against him. The affidavit details an incident in which Thompson had beaten a woman who was pregnant with his child. The report describes how he attempted to strangle her, leaving her with a black eye, and how she feared what he might do next. Though the name in the affidavit was not confirmed, it was widely believed that Gabriella was that woman. She had reason to be afraid. At the time of her murder, Thompson already had an active warrant for his arrest. But even with that warrant in place, he remained free. The system that was meant to protect her had left an opening wide enough for him to slip through. Those closest to her saw the warning signs, but recognizing danger is not the same as escaping it. Gabriella had already spent months trying to navigate the fear, trying to figure out the next step, and then she made a decision that would alter everything. She left Texas. She traveled to Colorado. There, far from home, she made a choice for herself, for her body, and for her future. But the choice that she made, one that should have been hers alone, was not something Thompson was willing to accept. Gabriella Gonzalez had returned to Texas the day before she died. Harold Thompson was waiting. Gabriella Gonzalez stood at a crossroads. A choice lay before her, one that she had made not out of impulse, but out of necessity. For months, she had felt the weight of an inescapable force pressing against her, dictating her movements, limiting her decisions. Now, for the first time in a long while, she had taken control. She was pregnant. But this pregnancy did not bring joy or anticipation. It brought fear. She had already seen what Harold Thompson was capable of. The rage, the accusations, the punishments disguised as outbursts. He had made his views clear. This child would be born. There was no discussion, no room for consideration. To him, her body was not her own. It never had been. Texas law had only made her options more complicated. Since the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, abortion had been outlawed in nearly all cases within the state. There were no clinics, no legal avenues for the choice she had already made. If she wanted to reclaim her future, she would have to leave, and so she did. Gabriella traveled to Colorado, a state where the laws still protected her right to decide. It was a journey many before her had taken, women crossing state lines, seeking care that had been stripped from them back home. But she did not go alone. Even in her absence, the presence of Harold Thompson loomed. Somewhere, within the digital records that trace the history of lives now lost, there are fragments of their final communications. Words exchanged over text, late-night calls that lasted too long, desperate pleas, unanswered messages. The growing storm of a man who felt his control slipping away. One message from Thompson stood out, typed in the heat of anger, unrelenting in its tone. "You don't get to do this." Another, shorter but far more direct. "You think you can leave me?" Gabriella never responded. She had long understood that arguing with him was useless. Any attempt to reason with him only invited more threats, more aggression. And so she did what she had done so many times before. She let the words sit, ignored them, tried to focus on the future. But a man like Harold Thompson does not forget, and he does not forgive. The days leading up to her return to Texas were marked by silence. Gabriella had done what she set out to do. There was no going back now. Yet, even as she booked her ticket home, an unease settled within her. Her sister, Melanie Rubio, had sensed it too. Gabriella had been distant, her voice softer, carrying an edge of exhaustion. "I just want to come home," she had said. Melanie had wanted to ask more, to press for details, to understand why there was such finality in her tone. But Gabriella had already moved on, shifting the conversation, brushing aside whatever thoughts had lingered beneath the surface. The reality, however, was clear. The moment Gabriella stepped back into Texas, she was within reach again. Thompson had been waiting. There is a documented pattern in cases like these. When a woman tries to leave an abusive partner, the risk of violence increases exponentially. Studies have shown that the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship is not during the arguments, nor the weeks of silence afterward. It is when the victim makes a definitive choice to walk away. Abusers thrive on control, and when that control is threatened, they react with force. Gabriella's decision had marked her. Thompson had spent the days of her absence constructing a world in which she had betrayed him. His messages, his calls, the unspoken anger that built upon itself, it had all led to this moment. He had already proven what he was capable of. The threats were not just words. Gabriella had felt his hands tighten around her throat once before. She had seen the rage in his eyes, the way his voice lowered, almost eerily calm, before the storm would hit. She had endured the aftermath of his violence, concealing bruises, making excuses. She had reported him once, thinking that maybe the act of speaking the truth would be enough to protect her. But that report had done little. And so, as she boarded the flight back to Dallas, she knew what awaited her. Her silence had not been enough to stop him. Thompson had been watching. Whether through mutual contacts, social media, or simply an understanding of her routine, he knew where to find her. When she landed, there was no warm welcome, no relief in being home. Instead, there was only the knowledge that she was back in the place where everything had gone wrong. She was within reach. In the hours before it happened, she went through the motions of an ordinary day. Conversations that would later be dissected for hidden meaning, movements that would be retraced. She may have believed, for a brief moment, that she had more time. That illusion would be shattered soon enough. Harold Thompson was already on his way. The air was heavy that evening. The streets of Dallas moved with their usual nature, cars rolling past, headlights cutting through the dusk, people coming and going, unaware that within moments, an unrelenting act of violence would unfold before them. Surveillance footage would later reveal the exact sequence of events. The moment Gabriella Gonzalez and Harold Thompson came into frame, their figures barely distinguishable in the grainy, monochrome feed. They were standing outside a gas station. The footage showed them walking, not side by side, but with a tension that was almost visible even through the distant lens of the security camera. A confrontation had begun. She had just returned from Colorado, a decision made, irreversible. She had chosen her path. But Harold Thompson was not a man who accepted choice, at least not when it defied him. His body language was rigid, aggressive. He was speaking, but the footage had no audio. His hand movements were sharp, cutting through the space between them. Gabriella stood firm, her posture defensive. Then, in a single motion, Thompson lunged. He grabbed her, his arms locking around her neck, pulling her backward, a chokehold. Gabriella struggled, her body twisted, her hands reaching for his arms, trying to loosen his grip. The footage showed her feet kicking against the pavement, desperate for leverage. She was fighting. Even as the oxygen was cut from her lungs, she fought. And then she broke free. Her body jerked forward, slipping from his grasp. She staggered, gasping for air, moving as fast as her legs would allow. But Thompson, he did not let her go. The gun was already in his hand. The footage captured the next moment with a chilling clarity. 1 step, 2 steps. The gun was raised. A single shot. Gabriella's body collapsed. The impact was immediate. She had no time to react, no time to turn, no time to beg. Her body hit the ground as the force of the bullet drove through her skull. But Thompson was not finished. The surveillance footage showed the motion, his body stiff, his arm extended, his focus unwavering. A second shot, a third, a fourth, down to the 7th. The gas station remained oblivious for just a second longer before the realization rippled through the scene. A man near the entrance turned sharply, his movements startled, hands instinctively raised. A car at the pump jolted forward, brakes slamming, hesitation between fight and flight. Thompson stood there for a moment, the gun still raised, and then he disappeared. The camera caught the final glimpse of him moving into the night. Gabriella lay motionless. The ground beneath her, once dry concrete, now carried the weight of her final moments. Forensic experts later examined the scene. Blood spatter analysis confirmed that the shots had been fired from a close distance. The first bullet had been instantly fatal. The others, unnecessary, excessive, each one carrying the weight of a rage long unchecked. Experts in criminal psychology have studied cases like these for decades. There is a pattern, a sequence of behaviors that escalate when control is lost. Harold Thompson had followed that pattern precisely. Control, possession, retaliation. His need to dominate had extended beyond argument, beyond threats. He had already tried force before, grabbing, choking, intimidating. But when she resisted, when she made a choice that defied him, he did what men like him do. He made sure she could never defy him again. Her murder was not an act of impulse. It was an execution. Within minutes, the first responders arrived. The gas station had erupted into chaos. Calls placed to 911, customers fleeing the area, others frozen in horror. A paramedic later recalled the scene in an interview. She was already gone when we got there. There was nothing we could do. Nothing they could do. Gabriella Gonzalez had fought. She had tried to escape. But in the end, the system that should have protected her had failed. And Harold Thompson had walked away into the night, leaving only silence behind. The body of Gabriella Gonzalez lay still as the flashing red and blue lights reflected off the pavement. As first officers on the scene moved, there was urgency, securing the area, scanning for witnesses. But the man responsible, the man who had fired those fatal shots, was already gone. Harold Thompson had vanished into the night. In the hours that followed, a search began. Law enforcement knew who they were looking for. They had known his name long before this night. And yet, until now, he had remained a free man. The investigation unfolded swiftly. Officers reviewed the security footage, watching frame by frame as the murder played out. The evidence was undeniable. There was no question of who had done it. Now, they needed to find him. Detectives followed a familiar process: interviews, phone records, surveillance analysis. They combed through Gabriella's contacts, searching for anyone who had spoken to Thompson after the crime. They visited his known addresses, places where he might seek refuge. But Harold Thompson knew how to disappear. His previous arrests had already given him an understanding of how law enforcement worked. He had been in trouble before. He had been wanted before. And yet, each time he had managed to walk free. Gabriella had reported him months earlier. She had described his aggression, his threats, his attacks. She had done what so many victims of domestic abuse are told to do. She had spoken out. But the system had not acted fast enough. Now she was gone, and Thompson was on the run. The search for him intensified. Detectives contacted informants, pressed his associates for information. Some denied knowing where he was. Others refused to speak at all, but his past gave them clues. Thompson had a pattern, places he returned to, people he relied on. He did not leave Dallas. He stayed close. He believed he could hide in plain sight. He was wrong. It was technology that would give him away. His phone, though powered off at times, still sent signals when turned back on. His habits so ingrained betrayed him. A call made, a message sent. Detectives traced his movements to a specific area, watching, waiting, then a sighting. On May 19, 2023, just days after the murder, officers moved in. He was found alone. There was no fight, no dramatic final stand, just a man who had run out of places to go. Harold Thompson was taken into custody, and yet, for Gabriella's family, for her children, for those who had loved her, the arrest did not bring her back. This case, like so many before it, was a reminder of a brutal truth. Domestic violence is not a private issue. It is not contained within walls, hidden behind closed doors. It spills into the streets, it escalates, and all too often, it ends in death. In the United States, more than half of all female homicide victims are killed by an intimate partner. Studies have shown that when a woman leaves an abusive relationship, her risk of being murdered increases by as much as 500%. Gabriella Gonzalez had tried to leave, but leaving was not enough. Her story joins the thousands of others, names and faces that should still be here, lives that should have continued. And as Harold Thompson sat in a holding cell, awaiting what came next, the question remained: how many more warnings will go unanswered? The trial of Harold Thompson began in a cold, quiet courtroom. It was a space built for justice, lined with rows of benches, where lives were dissected and fates decided. But for the family of Gabriella Gonzalez, it was a room filled with grief. The man who had taken her life now sat before them, dressed in a prison uniform, his wrists bound in cuffs. He showed no emotion, no remorse. The state of Texas had charged Harold Thompson with murder. The prosecution had assembled an unshakable case. The evidence was undeniable. Clear footage of the crime, the testimonies of those who had seen it unfold, the forensic reports detailing every shot fired. The courtroom listened as the lead prosecutor addressed the jury. This was not an accident. This was not a crime of passion. This was an execution. Jurors sat motionless, their faces tense, as the footage from the gas station played on the courtroom screen. The grainy images flickered, the confrontation, the struggle, the gunshot. There was no dispute. Gabriella's family sat in silence. Her sister, Melanie Rubio, lowered her head. Her mother, her hands trembling, gripped a folded tissue. Witnesses were called. First responders, medical examiners, detectives who had traced Thompson's steps. Each one painted the same picture: a man who had controlled, threatened, and in the end, killed. The defense had little to argue. They claimed Thompson had acted in a moment of rage, that his emotions had clouded his judgment. But the evidence crushed any attempt at justification. Gabriella had not provoked. She had not threatened. She had tried to leave. And for that, she was murdered. The jury deliberated. The wait was short. Hours later, they returned. The room stilled. The judge, towering above them all, asked for the verdict. The foreman, a man in his late 50s, cleared his throat. His voice was steady. We, the jury, find the defendant, Harold Thompson, guilty of murder. A single sentence, the weight of it falling upon the room. Gabriella's family embraced one another. Quiet sobs filled the air. The process had played out as expected, but there was no victory in this moment. No relief. The judge turned to Thompson. You stole a life, a mother, a daughter, a sister. You left her children without a mother and her family in grief. For that, you will spend the rest of your life in prison. A life sentence. Thompson blinked. His expression remained unreadable. The gravity of his fate settled upon him, yet he offered nothing. No reaction, no words. For Gabriella's family, the ruling was justice. But justice is not the same as peace. The sentence meant that Thompson would never walk free, that he would never harm another, that he would grow old within the confines of prison walls, surrounded only by the weight of his own actions. But it did not bring Gabriella back. As the court emptied, her family stepped out into the daylight. Reporters waited, cameras flashing, microphones extended. Someone asked how they felt. Melanie's voice was quiet but firm. She should still be here. And with that, they walked away. The world outside carried on. But for them, time had already stopped. A woman had been taken. And a sentence, no matter how severe, would never be enough to fill the space she left behind. Gabriella Gonzalez should still be here. She should be raising her 3 children, watching them grow, guiding them through life. She should be celebrating birthdays, laughing with her sister, and making plans for the future. But all of that was stolen from her in an instant. Gabriella did what so many victims of domestic abuse do. She stayed silent for as long as she could, hoping things would change. When that became impossible, she spoke up, and when speaking up wasn't enough, she tried to leave. Domestic violence is not just personal. It is not a private issue, something to be handled quietly behind closed doors. It is a crisis that claims lives, leaves families shattered, and continues unchecked in far too many cases. What could have been done differently? Could Gabriella have been saved? Could an intervention at the right time have prevented this tragedy? What do you think? Let us know in the comments. And if you or someone you know is in an abusive relationship, help is available. There are resources, shelters, and professionals ready to offer support. No one should have to face this alone. To keep spreading awareness about cases like this, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Your engagement helps bring these stories to light, ensuring that victims are not forgotten and that their voices are heard. Gabriella Gonzalez's story ends here, but the fight for justice, for protection, for change must continue.